Commission order. Let the minutes record that all commissioners are in attendance, except for Commissioner Huron, who will be arriving late. We're joined by Chloe Moore from the Montgomery County Planning Commission. That Borough Engineer Eric Johnson is joining us online, and we have 5, 9, 10 members of the public attending, including 2 council members, the chair of our HARB, and 4 people representing the applicant for 230 Haverford Avenue. So that is who is in attendance tonight. Tonight's the agenda for the special meeting, which was published yesterday. Look for it. Is really breaks down into 2 parts. The first part is consideration of rezoning requests that would pertain to the 5A district, and particularly related to the concept that's been proposed for 230 Haverford Avenue. And the second part of the agenda pertains to discussion of specific code amendments that would be related to that issue as well as to other issues. I'd like to give a little background to start this meeting, in case folks haven't been following this every day, like some of us have. The applicant for development at 230 Haverford Avenue, Tim Rubin, filed an application in 2019 or 2018, was it, for redevelopment of that site. And that application has been on hold while Mr. Rubin and the borough negotiated certain matters, particularly related to the sale of the parking lot behind all the commercial buildings in Haverford Avenue. In March of this year, Mr. Rubin came to the Planning Commission and made a presentation of a new concept for developing the site. It is not an official application. It's just a sharing of an idea that he would like to explore further for the development of the site that is different from the idea that is in the application. Those documents, we just got started.
Sorry, I'm late.
Okay. The documentation of that presentation, the Planning Commission minutes, and the original application are all accessible to the public on the borough webpage under its information, and then there's a special tab for 230 Haverford Avenue. So you can go look all that up. Now, subsequent to that presentation, we wrote Mr. Rubin and Borough Council a letter, we being the Planning Commission, outlining several issues that, as this concept is further developed, that we would like to look at further, more closely. Those issues were, here's my agenda. So there were 5 issues that we flagged. Those issues were the massing, scale, and architecture of the new buildings, parking and circulation, retail mix, housing, and the application of a green building, proposed zoning amendments, and other ideas. Now, those are ideas, those are issues that will be explored for a long time. Subsequent to that letter, the Planning Commission received correspondence through the borough office from Mr. Rubin's team requesting 8 or 9 specific zoning code amendments that they felt were necessary for them to have in place in order to to explore this concept further. So that came to us. We brought them to the table at our last Planning Commission meeting, so that the public would know that these requests had been made. And then we tabled consideration of those requests until this special meeting. So the purpose of this special meeting is to further consider those requests. as well as I said earlier, a broader set of zoning changes that are that have been proposed by the Planning Commission over the past few months, some of which are related to this and some of which are related to development at 714 Montgomery Avenue. Council is interested, has given us direction that they would like to consider all of those zoning changes in one zoning ordinance amendment. So that's the second part of the meeting, is to talk about that zoning ordinance amendment. So the first part of the meeting is to talk about the general zoning requests that have been made by Mr. Rubin and his team. And the second part of the meeting is to talk about specific language. The requests that came to us, the zoning requests that came to us, could be broken into 4 basic categories, and there were 2 sort of very administrative requests as well. Those 4 basic categories were requests for consideration of allowing 3-story buildings on site. Right now, the code allows 26-foot buildings and 2 stories. The request is for 36-foot buildings and 3 stories. The second request is to allow for mixed-use buildings that are wider than 65 feet. Right now, the code limits the width of new mixed-use buildings to 65 feet. The third request was to allow for, to allow for what we all commonly call the Little Gym building to be used for residential. Currently, the code could allow for mixed use, which would require some sort of commercial use on the ground floor. And the request is for that building to be used solely for residential, which would be an apartment building. And the fourth request was amendments to the code that would allow for a through block passage, a courtyard, plaza, as it were, to be created to allow for people to move between Haverford Avenue and the parking lot behind, something a little more generous than the current passage we have now, which is about this wide. Have I characterized your request accurately?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So what I would like to do is have a conversation with the Planning Commission about each of those ideas in general. 3-story buildings, 65 buildings that are wider than 65 feet, the conversion of the Little Gym solely to residential, and the creating code revisions that will allow for that passage to occur. My practice at the Planning Commission is to sort of get an agreement on the ideas first, the outcomes first, and then secondly, to do the code. Because if we can't agree on where we're going, we can't write the code. So that's what I'd like to do for the first half of the meeting, is talk about those things. Now, you may remember there were other issues raised in that letter that we wrote. What about parking? What about retail? What about housing? What about circulation? Those are not issues that are specifically related to these requests tonight. Those would be issues that could be discussed further if Mr. Rubin came forward with an official proposal. At the moment, the feeling of Mr. Rubin and of the borough's team is that these zoning changes would be necessary for Mr. Rubin to have the ability to come forward with a proposal. And that proposal coming to us and coming to council would then allow for the full exploration of all these issues. So tonight, I'd like as much as possible, because we have very short amount of time. What, 5 hours, guys? Is that what we agreed? Very short amount of time to discuss these very complicated issues. And so with respect to all the concerns in the community about these things, I'd like to focus on those specific topics, which will enable us to get to the point that hopefully Mr. Rubin will feel comfortable enough to submit an application, and then we can discuss these issues at more length, more fully among the commission and the council, and through the normal, through the hard, normal processes we have in Narberth to discuss land use developments. So those, I hope we can abide by those, that understanding. I'll ask first, before we proceed any further, do any planning commissioners have any questions about the meeting and the agenda and the format of the conversation? Anyone? Okay.
I have just an overall question, and God knows I'm not a lawyer, but if I'm hearing this correctly, we're being asked to change the zoning code for a specific property. And in my layman's understanding, that sounds a lot like spot zoning. Do we know that this is going to pass muster with the solicitor and that we're not all wasting our time here?
I also star as a lawyer in like TV procedurals, but I'm not a lawyer.
Has this been raised in any venue that we know about?
I will say that the amendment, the code amendments we've been working on, and which were circulated today, have actually been drafted by the solicitor with some revisions by Michael and me based on conversations we've been having. So I think we can assume prima facie that anything the solicitor gives us will pass muster. However, Mr. Careless, you are the legal representative for Mr. Rubin, and I think you wanted to weigh in on that.
Sure. Is it okay if I stay here, or
you can stay here as long as folks can hear you?
Okay. So you're correct. You're in the Pennsylvania zone.
I'm sorry, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Bob Careless, Mr. Reed's attorney. Thanks, attorney. You're correct. Under Pennsylvania law, you can't spot zone a property through a zoning ordinance, which is why we submitted our request amendments for the entirety of 5A. So what you're passing is not, we're not asking you to say, rewrite the ordinance to say this applies to everything between North Narberth Avenue and Mapes. We're saying it applies to the entirety of the 5A. So not only, so yes, our property would benefit from the passage, but also anybody else would benefit from the passage of it as well. In the 5A, that is.
Okay, thank you.
And that's
I will clarify that while Mr. Careless is generally correct, some of the provisions apply to certain areas of the 5A. As they're proposed to. Because as you know, we have certain rules that apply just to Windsor Avenue.
Right.
We have certain rules that apply just to Haverford Avenue or Narberth Avenue. So some of the things in the code we've been working on apply to smaller areas, but the general idea is they apply to a number of similarly situated properties. I think would be the way to put it. And like I said, the solicitor has actually drafted these amendments, and so sometimes those of us who think we know better ask him, because that's spot zoning. But anything I think he gives us, we assume he believes is appropriate within the context of the state law. That's his job to make sure of that. Is there any questions in the audience about how we're going to proceed tonight? Is everyone clear on that? Okay, so I'm just stalling, really. So the first topic, I think, let's talk about the idea of allowing three-story buildings, certainly on Haverford Avenue or throughout the 5A district. Excuse me, you'll recall, for many years in Narberth, almost forever in Narberth, until just a couple of years ago, that was the norm. Three-story buildings were allowed by our code. They were in the form-based code. When it passed, council lowered that limit to 2 stories and 26 feet about the time Mr. Rubin's application came in. And so now council and Mr. Rubin have asked for reconsideration of that and restoration of that to what had been the norm.
Excuse me, can you clarify 2 stories on the south side of Haverford?
I think the code was I think that the code now calls for 26 feet and 2 stories throughout the 5A, except along Windsor Avenue, where taller buildings are not. I keep relying on Mike.
Well, so I think it's the 26 was the average height.
You also had an average height.
And I think that
was it 26 or 30?
like the non-average one I thought was 32 or something.
32, but it was still 2 stories.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's my recollection.
So I guess the height is 32 feet and 2 stories.
But I'm sorry,
It's
to interrupt
okay.
again. So but the two new buildings that Mr. Rubin's building already are 3 stories. So there must have been a
I
3-story.
think those were approved before.
Before the Form zoning code?
Yes, no,
No,
not
no,
before
it was-
the zoning, but
It was before the change.
Before
was
the
made.
change. Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, so they were approved sometime before that
Okay.
change was made, in early 2020, I think.
Yeah.
So, okay. So let's talk about that then. I guess I'd like to hear, and maybe just also to keep things on track, maybe we just go around quickly and get the sense of each commissioner about that issue and figure out, where if there is a center of gravity on these issues, and I can decide to start with Adam or Michael or who'd prefer to go. You want to go, Dave? I see you.
No, I was just flipping the coin. But I'm happy I'm happy to
Go ahead. How do you feel about the
I have no problem with 3 stories throughout the downtown. Never did. I was instrumental in the enactment of it in the original form-based code. I think the street can handle 3 stories on both sides without any issue. There are endless numbers of successful small towns across America that have 3-story facades facing a comparatively narrow street that feel intimate and entirely appropriate. I think that this is one of them. I've always thought that way, and I'm happy to see it going back to 3 stories, with or without a setback. The issue of a setback on the 3rd story has come up and will undoubtedly come up again, and that is an option. We need to be careful about how we implement any treatment of the facade on the south side or the north side that is continuous, uninterrupted, and potentially poor.
which we'll get to.
Get to that. I'll come back.
And who would like to jump in next? Go ahead.
I basically agree with Jim. I was not in favor of the change to 2 stories. I'm still not in favor of it. I'm completely comfortable with 3 stories in the 5A district, and especially along the south side of Haverford. I'm not necessarily opposed to some kind of a step back for the 3rd floor, although I don't think it's necessary. I think that establishing a cornice line at the base of the 3rd story is fine. I don't think you would have to step it back very much. But as I say, I think 3 stories is perfectly acceptable, even desirable.
I agree with all the things that y'all have stated. One of the things I did when I was thinking through this was take a look at different small downtowns, like lists of, people's lists of what great small town downtowns were, and kind of like went on Google and looked around, and I found basically what you were describing is that, a lot of them have 3 stories, existing in different parts of the downtown built environment. In Narberth, the regulatory environment allowed for it. I actually, and just as a historical quirk note, I went back to like the original zoning code, and I guess if you like, I don't know, insofar as you can get into someone's mind, but at the time that they initially adopted the zoning code, and I think a couple decades after that, they had downtown zoned at 4 stories, and obviously no one's proposing that, but just in terms of like the way that I guess you could try to define how they were thinking about how the next 100 years might go. I think that they were probably expecting at least some form of vertical building from that, at least that point in history. So in terms of the things that you all outlined, I think 3 stories is in character, in keeping. And I also think it's important from a outcomes in terms of the health of our downtown, in terms of one of the things that our comprehensive plan calls for directly, which is more human beings near the downtown area to be able to patronize our businesses and keep them healthy at a time when a lot of people are, ordering things to their house. It's a lot easier to get to something when it's a couple steps away, especially if it's raining. We've seen over the last couple of days. So a little bit of a shotgun blast of the things that have been on my mind the last couple of weeks, but.
Okay. Who'd like to go next?
I also agree. I don't have any issues with doing the full 3 stories. I can see, a decorative benefit to having a setback, but I don't necessarily think that it's necessary. And I do think that the increased occupancy on that land in particular makes a lot of sense for activation and continued activation of that corridor.
Jen or Adam or Freddie?
Oh, I'll jump in and say that I'm not opposed to some 3-story, but I am not for what could become a monolithic row of 3-story buildings. I think it's really important that we have some cadence, some variety of heights, cornice lines, window treatment, windows, decorative elements, if you want to use decorative elements, and that we need to be careful about width. I mean, we're talking about width at the same time, so I don't think you can talk about height without discussing the width of the facades and the treatment. I think, it's a very small downtown. There are, what we're talking about here is a major portion of our downtown. And I truly believe that if we just allow 3-story across the board in all of downtown, the potential for, and also it's an historic district. So how can we say that we are comfortable losing the historic fabric so readily on this particular site? And then what happens if someone comes along and wants to tear down one of the buildings on another site? I mean, if we're saying 3 stories throughout 5A, and we're letting one project go through, whether it's conditional use or not, we're inviting the destruction of all of the historic buildings in downtown, and that the HARB, which was brought into play to review projects that have historic character in the borough and provide the kind of nuanced architecture that we all have come to appreciate and love, I feel like we've got to be really careful about what gets built there. There's got to be variety. There's got to be various heights. There's got to be different architecture. And I know this has been mentioned before, that maybe not the same architect designs the whole row. I've also been really a strong advocate of building on the parking lot, because that would take a new monolithic building, if you want, along the train tracks. Build on top of the parking lot. People say, well, what about the cars? What about the parking situation? Build on the parking lot. It's a big parking lot. I have not tried to lay a garage out on that lot. Maybe Mr. Rubin has, and maybe he could speak to that. But it is, in fact, a wasteland right now back there. We've already said that before. Build on it. Leave the front of Haverford Avenue, lower scale, more interesting, and take the monolithic building into the back of the site, which is a proposal, as I've said before, that we've seen before. And I'm confused about why we can't look at that now and why we're jumping ahead to create a zoning change when we haven't really investigated the possibility of building on a parking lot. And also, the work that we're doing on Station Circle. The people who are working on Station Circle should be part of this conversation. Because it's ultimately, it's not just this site on Haverford Avenue. It's this site and how it relates to Station Circle and the whole rest of the downtown.
Okay.
And I haven't turned in.
Sure. When we're finished, so I left that one part. When we're finished going through these topics, then we'll invite public comment from everyone. However, Heidi asked the question, what is the purpose considering this proposal when you already have it on the table? So maybe you could think about that. We could ask you to address that in a couple of minutes. Just again, I mean, I know you talked about it before, but just since the question is raised, when we finish the commissioners, then maybe we'll ask you that question. Okay, go ahead, Adam.
I was a little surprised when the zoning was changed to 2 stories, to be honest. And I do think we do need more people in town to support the shops and so on. But with that said, I think we should be really careful with the 100% block in downtown in terms of the outcomes of the zoning. So I think people come to this block because A, it has goods and services they want to buy, or B, that they like the village scale of it. They enjoy being there. And that could be lost if mistakes are made. I know people think it's no big deal how big the buildings are, or at least in South US, I think you're sort of minimizing that. It has 3-story buildings now. That's why I was sort of surprised that we would make them non-conforming, for example. But, you know, it does affect solar access. It does affect a variety of conditions at the sidewalk level, how big the buildings are. And I do think that having some of them have a setback might reduce that effect considerably. I also think the purpose of a setback isn't just, it is to decrease the scale, give more visual variety, let more light down to the street. But it also creates usable outdoor private space, which is a huge amenity for urban living, right? If you're in an apartment, you don't have a yard. You don't have any outdoor space of your own. But if you have a terrace, you have a place that you can put potted plants. You have a place that you can put a deck chair. You have a place where you can have al fresco dinner that you make yourself on your own stove. So a lot of cities actually require apartments to have balconies or outdoor space for that reason, because it's an important, it's important for quality of life in an apartment. So I think there's actually multiple functions that could be played by the setback. If it's only a partially required, in other words, if the development will have to set all of its property back at the 3rd story, it will help provide some of that variety of bulk, breaking up the bulk of projects possibly. Beyond that, I do think that you know, the architectural detailing matters, but that's not the question you've asked.
All right, and
I do. First I have a question, then I have a comment. My first question is, with this proposed revision to the zoning, does this mean that no longer is the green building code or the green building contingency a part of the criteria for 3 stories?
it would.
It would be, okay.
I can explain that. It's actually part of what's in here. And I can explain that here in your comments.
Okay, sure. I also, like both my colleagues here, do not take issue with 3 stories on Haverford. I think right now, on the one hand, we're dealing with density and affordability go hand in hand. Smaller units, higher density, we're going to get a larger population that's supporting this kind of development, will support the downtown, and all things have already been said. Totally in favor of that. I think it's a step in the right direction. Further concerns, such as those expressed by Heidi, I think what's also sort of at stake here is the idea that 3 stories on Haverford will be the same 3 stories everywhere in Haverford. More innovative thinking about the use of materials, about glass, about mass timber, these very new and very hip materials never enter the conversation. We always start with how tall is it, and what is it going to look like, and how is it going to be more of the same. I'm thinking to myself, how can we be more on board with the sustainability practices that our design professionals are putting forward at this time in the practice for architecture, like those I mentioned already, mass timber and glass too. And these state-of-the-art building enclosures, these envelopes, are also energy efficient. And it's a way to not only increase diversity in a commercial corridor, but also be more environmentally sensitive to the issues that we're facing in terms of climate change and the climate agenda that Narberth wants to put forward. So to limit this discussion to a matter of is it 3 stories or not, I think is premature. I think we need to take this discussion to the level of what materials are we building with? What is this building envelope going to be made of? How is it going to be built? What is, matters of constructability? I like this idea of having a passage from Haverford to the back side, to the south side of the south side, between the train tracks and the back of the buildings. I think there's great opportunity there to really develop a very unique, cool space, maybe with like some of those not incandescent, but those, what do they call them? The Edison light bulbs, and, ambience, and a place for people to gather and have dinner and participate. I think you get one good business there, and you are going to have a thriving district. We're not that big. All it takes, I think, is one very successful business. And then others will flock around, and all of a sudden you'll see this great vibrancy. But we have to be creative, and we have to be forward thinking, and we have to be innovative with our use of materials. As we, not just look at 230 Haverford, which is actually more than that, but as we think about how will it develop down the line.
Yeah, thank you. So, you asked a question about the green buildings. So in the second part of our meeting, when we talk about how any changes may be incorporated into an ordinance or into the code, the recommendations that the Planning Commission has made in the past, like last year in November, that the ability to build a 3-story building should be conditioned on following green building practices is what is in this code, what we've agreed to, as would also be the case for changes related to the 5B district. As we've discussed, those would be linked to an agreement to follow our recommendations about green building. The code also it codifies the recommendations we made that ADUs follow the green building code too. So that's all in here.
Okay.
We'll discuss that when we get to it, but I want you to know it's in here, the things we've already agreed to. Okay. Mr. Rubin, a question was raised by Heidi. Why have you asked us to consider this concept as opposed to the one you originally proposed?
Sure. So just to step back for a second, as everyone knows, in December of 2019, we filed a plan that speaks to the concept that's on the borough's website. That would put the density in the rear of the site at approximately 50 units, and it proposed to keep Haverford Avenue low. COVID hit, the world turned upside down. Mr. Rubin concentrated on making sure that those other 2 projects got built before we took another project off the approval grounds through the approval process. When the two projects were sufficient, they were substantially complete, we came back to the borough and like developers do in every municipality, we have meetings with the staff, the engineers, and make sure, that issues are worked out before you start going through the formal meeting process, right? So your questions about interpretation, things like that. And there was a number of those meetings. And one of the things that came out of those meetings is from the borough side was the vision, instead of developing in the rear of the site, would you consider developing on Haverford Avenue as an alternative vision to the site as a concept? That doesn't mean you would get the project approved, but just as a concept. You want to make sure it's quite expensive to develop a plan, as everyone knows. And you want to make sure that you're putting good money after a good project. So we had a plan ready to go, which was the 2019 plan. Mr. Rubin said, I'm willing to pause and come up with the sketch plan that we presented in March to the Planning Commission to show that it would work. Now, what was on the table was a lower density development too. It was never on the table that we would take the 50 units and put the 50 units out on Haverford Avenue. So, to Mr. Rubin's credit, he said, okay, and I'll also de-densify what I probably could yield from the site. So in order for that, if that is a vision, again, when we presented this, again, what the Planning Commission would be used to seeing as a sketch plan that used to have, and they won't have anymore. But, essentially what we had was your sketch plan phase type of drawing to say, this is the vision that we would look to implement should the zoning ordinance. Now, if you're going to have a vision, your zoning ordinance should also see that vision. And so from our perspective, if we're going to move forward with that plan that we presented in March, the zoning ordinance should envision that plan, not just for our property, but just as a concept in the 5A irrelevant. So that's why in January we did submit a list of amendments that we thought were necessary in order to effectuate that vision. And as Mr. Bresci said, if those amendments are adopted, that would then provide a pathway for us to come back and begin what's going to be a very intensive process to go through the massing and the elevations and the drawing of plan of parking and things of that nature. So that's not too long-winded answer to your question. It's mostly just we agreed to go forward with a vision, and this would have to come with it.
Right. And the idea of approaching things this way was prompted through your interactions with the borough as you were discussing. Okay, well, thank you. It sounds to me like, at least on this issue, and I know I'm trying to compartmentalize things because I know there'll be opportunities in the future, even later tonight, to discuss some of these other issues. It sounds like there's a very strong consensus that three-story buildings are, I didn't state, by the way, but I think I agree that three-story buildings are appropriate. I feel pretty strongly that some variation in that third floor, some setbacks, some not setback, would have a lot of benefit for all the reasons people have said. Anyway, so it sounds to me like there's a very strong consensus that three-story height limit is appropriate, that there's also, I think, openness to the desire to have some level of setting back. So there's not a consistent three-story, but that there's some variation. So what I'd like to suggest is we sort of rest there on this issue, and then we can talk more about the details when we talk about the code later in the meeting. Second issue, which is probably the most complicated issue that I'd like to put on the table, is building widths. I think it was in 2020 that we passed a series of amendments to the code that really added a lot of detail to what we envision mixed-use buildings to be, how they would scale the buildings, architectural composition of the buildings. And we did that in anticipation that there would one day be more development of mixed-use buildings in the 5A district. And we wanted to make sure we had robust tools in place to manage them. One of the requirements, which came after a long bit of negotiation and among us and the council and consideration of the building widths that exist in Narberth already, was that the maximum width of a of a new mixed-use building should be 65 feet. Now, for those of you who have trouble, like me, imagining what that means, 65 feet is more or less, it's a little less, I think, than the width of the building you're building at the corner of Essex and Haverford. That's 67 feet, something like that, right? So it's more or less the width of the building at the corner of Essex and Haverford. It's about the width of American Family Market and half that. It's about, I think American Family Market's about 42 feet. So 65 would be 1.5 times that. That's what we're talking about. That is the maximum width.
I
Now,
think it's roughly the width of this building.
that's even better.
I counted the tiles.
The width of this building is about 45 feet.
This is 65.
65, sorry, you're
The
right.
width of this room.
The room.
The room.
Yes.
It's room, it's about 65 feet. So that would be the widest building we would allow right now for that width. Do you know offhand, Tim, how long your frontage on Haverford Avenue is?
It's about 135, 140 feet, somewhere in that area.
That's between the driveway and.
Yeah, it starts, it's nice. If you can imagine that plan that we presented,
I can call it up, by the way.
it's the width of, I'll refer to the names, like the Mapes to the Get Cafe, or what would be the plaza before you get to the Get Cafe. It's about 140 feet.
Okay. Adam, can you enable screen share? We can call up the site plan from your presentation so people can see that. So this is what we're talking about. Can buildings be wider than this?
Yeah, the
No, I don't see
projector.
it, the projector's not.
Oh, sorry.
I could try to make it go.
Can
We
you?
have a hard time.
Well, we have a digital copy, but I'm realizing if I put it on my screen, folks in the audience can't see it. Well, we'll get it up as soon as we can. If you can help us out, Chloe. that'd be- So
No promises.
the question I think
Alternative.
for us to consider is, would planning commissioners be open to entertaining buildings that are wider than 65 feet? In this case, I think we should ask, and if so, under what circumstances or conditions do you think ought to be associated with that?
This room is 60 feet.
Pardon me?
This room is 60.
60. That's still okay, 16 to 65 feet.
I'll measure to the railing.
You know what they say about planners, you put 8 of them at a table, you get 10 different answers. Right? That's what you're getting tonight. So anyway, the question for the planning commissioners, and we'll do the same thing, we'll go around the table and we'll see what folks think is what do you think about this this idea? And if you do think it's worth considering buildings that are wider than 65 feet, under what conditions do you think that could occur? Go ahead. Before you start, Jim, this is the existing conditions, correct? Correct. Okay. So folks, this is the south side of Haverford Avenue. It's the existing conditions with the stores that exist now. I'll demarcate it. So this being American Family Market, about 42 feet, 45, more or less, that width. And so you can see that's about 135 altogether.
You want me to get it?
Sure.
All right.
Just help us understand the scale here.
This is existing, so when I said 140 is from the far side of Mapes, where you stop short, because remember, the Get building is going to remain, and then we're going to have a plaza here, so it's somewhere in this neighborhood over here. Okay. All right.
Okay.
What we're looking at in that plan of existing conditions is, excuse me, a row of buildings which conform to the storefronts that we see when you walk up the street. That's the way it was built. No developer is going to build 18 to 20 foot buildings, and I put that in air quotes. You're going to build a building and you're going to subdivide it. That's by some means, depending on who the tenants are, is that right?
Yeah, at the first floor, the commercial level, this
Yeah.
building, to your point, could be broken up and would be broken up, as I said in March. Based on leasing, and I certainly can't tell you exactly how many tenants and what the frontages would be, but there's things going on at street level, at the pedestrian level. You're gonna break this thing up based on individual storefronts and have that same variety, that same choppy rhythm that you have now with different materials, with awnings, all that, and then,
Great segue to my point.
okay.
What we are concerned about is the rhythm that is perceivable to pedestrians on the street. I don't care how big the building is, I would imagine it would be the whole block. That's the building. But what we see when we walk up and down the street, and we're looking at a building built in 2023 and 4, let's say, isn't a series of party walls. It was in 1910, or whatever it was that street was built. It's a subdivision within a steel framework, probably, that is that sort of overarches over the demising partitions that separate tenants. I don't care about structure that holds up the building. I care about the appearance of a rhythm, and the funkier the rhythm is, for me, the better. Because what we have now is a funky rhythm that's it would be very hard to set up to design that. But what we're going to ask you to do in the end here is to approximate the funkiness of the existing street, including its goofy rhythm and its varied heights and all that, which is what people love about having it. So the size of the building, to my way of thinking, is immaterial because it's a structural, pardon me, my voice is leaving me. It's a structural consideration more than anything else. We care about what the passerby sees when they walk down the street. That's the Narberth that we are hopeful we can perpetuate.
Yeah, that's the vision, and I would only point out that when I spoke in March, I mentioned an example literally directly across the street where you have the old Y, and to the pedestrian, to the naked eye, it's choppy, there's different things going on, it's plenty funky, but if you notice up above, it's the ground floor of one, I'll say, monolithic building. Not that our building's going to be monolithic, we would absolutely not ever propose to do anything like that with or without a planning commission. But again, just confirming your point, we're getting plenty funky at the pedestrian level with materials and all kinds of different variety that to a customer or a community member, they wouldn't know that it's one building. It would appear as a bunch.
So if that's the case, then the width of the building is, in my mind, a moot point. It's immaterial.
Yeah, I would reiterate that there's nothing magic about 65 feet. That is an arbitrary number. What matters is how the facade is handled and how the rhythm is established. And, the width of that structural box is completely secondary to the handling of the materials on the facade and how it's broken down. I get a little worried when I keep on hearing the word funky because I don't want kind of cartoony architecture either. I don't want some Disney-like, vision of what deep, quaky little county should look like.
I retract the word funky.
We're talking about real building here and real architecture, the real rhythm, and how you break down the scale in an architectural way. And that's what concerns me, not 65 feet.
Also like to jump in. Yeah.
I mean, I can't help but want to piggyback off of this whole funky conversation, which is now, if I had to translate funky into professional design terms, I would say it's a modern sensibility to scale. where if you're walking down a sidewalk and you are constantly fronted by a ceaseless storefront, you never get a chance, you never get the relief of a setback where you can actually see what the store has to offer. You can actually feel invited to enter. If you're constantly fronted by a storefront, there's no real invitation to enter. So I think that's a really important part of this understanding of rhythm. You know, you have your storefront where you have the store, and then you have your invitation to enter, your storefront and invitation to enter. Those kinds of, I think that's what you're alluding to when you speak of rhythm at the pedestrian scale. Now, what happens above can be something entirely, you know, the scale through the perspective, from a perspective of being a pedestrian is something different. But I just wanted to elaborate a little bit on that.
Jennifer.
I mean, I agree from the building size perspective that 65 feet doesn't, it's just an arbitrary number. But from an undulation or material break concept, I actually think that 65 feet is too large for the scale of Haverford Ave and the 5A district. And that there should be maybe a smaller distance that's specified. But I also think that that conversation should be had with the business owners, because you obviously the code shouldn't make it impossible for a storefront to be the same for an entire commercial area. So like if one tenant is gonna have 40 feet, then we shouldn't specify that there's an undulation at 25. But you know, 40 may be the right distance. 65 just feels too large to specify over the length of the building for requiring that break in zero.
We would love to go next.
I'd just like to point out that the Y building is 2 stories with a height approximately 25 feet. So we're talking about a 25-foot cornice line, perhaps with a step back for a 3rd story. And the way the ordinance is written, it's 10 feet back then for 60% of the building. That may be okay. That may be enough to break up a very long facade, but the 36 feet does trouble me. If that's the height of the buildings that are being built right now on the gas station site and the Rickland site, that's tall. And what we need is a drawing that shows, and I'm sure, Mr. Rubin, you could provide it, a drawing that shows what that street looks like with a 36-foot high building, 65 feet or more along that block. I think that would be a very important image for us all to see and have in our minds before we say that we're okay with 36 feet continuously for 65 feet or greater. And again, the ordinance suggests that we're going to break it down and that there are going to be some setbacks at 10 feet back that will undulate, and they'll break it up a bit. But the Y building is in fact a 2-story building. So it doesn't feel overwhelming. And in fact, a lot of the really nice early buildings that are broken down, I'm thinking one in Newport that's famous as one of the first commercial strip buildings with retail on the bottom and apartments above. I mean, it's a 2-story building and it's lovely because it's smaller in scale. But again, you start getting 36 feet all the way across, it's going to feel massive for our downtown. We're not Phoenixville. I mean, Phoenixville has buildings like that all the way down the main street, but it's a much wider street and it's actually overwhelming. I don't think they're wrong. And just one other point, Manayunk also has rows of 3-story buildings, but they're broken down the way we're all suggesting, is that there is small storefronts that are broken down. It's not monolithic across the top. It's broken down by townhouse dimensions, row home dimensions, and that's what makes it feel more people friendly.
Who else would like to go?
When I was thinking through this was one of the more kind of difficult ones because I wasn't here for the conversation when I guess it was initially adopted. And so the thing that ended up resonating that made sense to me was when I heard some of y'all describe the actual values behind the concepts that we're talking about. Specifically, it's not so much about the way that the structure is constructed, it's about the way that you experience the structure. And so from that perspective, I think a lot of the things that were already stated, I just want to reflect that as well, which is, yes, I mean, like, I think it makes sense that specific line isn't a hard and fast line, as long as we can get the pedestrian environment right, and that there's all of the variation and things that make for a interesting and vital space.
You like to?
You ever heard the story of the restaurant that was so successful they expanded their dining room and then went out of business? And that story is told. I mean, it's like apocryphal in the restaurant business, but I guess the moral of the story, right, is supposed to be that when the restaurant is crowded and vital and everyone's on their toes, people come and it's successful. But when you overscale it and the people spread out, then it loses that vibrancy, it loses that edge, and then they stop coming. And meanwhile, the rent went up because the fixed space got more expensive, and it fails. The Y building is 70 feet long. If it was a monolithic facade, it would have been actually, when it was first built, it would have been much more homogeneous, but it's been essentially funkified, right? With all of the signage bands and customizations, which is why it doesn't read so much as one big building, but it's still only it's close to 65 feet. And it's 2 stories. And I think part of what kind of Heidi's, I think, sort of tapping into, you may not agree with this, Heidi, but is the idea that there's essentially a system of scales in urbanism. Like in the city, things get bigger, right? You still need human scale, though. You still need human scale doors, windows, ornamentation, architectural features, or you won't want to be there, right? But physically, the buildings start to get much bigger. The blocks tend to get much bigger. But this particular block, this is like a village. It's a village of extremely small structures and extremely fine grain. And that's what we have today. And there's pros and cons to that, obviously. You're constrained in the size of the storefronts, but on the other hand, you don't have the problem of the restaurant that's so big it fails. You can mess this up really easily. The Elm building is about 190 feet long or something, 170 feet long. I mean, it's to put that in scale, the Elm is a similar size to this parcel. And they've done a lot to try to, it's residential, it's not commercial, right? And they've done a lot to try to modulate the facade and break down the bulk. And it's somewhat successful, but the Elm is still a pretty big building. It doesn't really read as a village, right? It is more of an urban building. And I do think there's a place for that. But I think we run a real risk with this particular block of not having it be successful if we don't get the massing right. Not the massing, it's like you have to feel comfortable in the space. The other thing about it is, as the plan shows, there's like basically a dozen doors facing this one little block, right? Plus all the storefront windows. It's taxpayer retail, which is the name for a building you put up to pay the taxes while you wait to build something, your real project, when the economy gets better. But the economy never got better. That fine grainness of the doors, though, that's what, when you're walking along, there's always something that's like catching your eye that you're looking at. Your eye can go from moment to moment to moment, and you don't get bored, right? When you don't feel monolithic. So if you were to replace that with just 2 or 3 doors, no matter how good the architecture or how good the signage is, it may not work. So, I think, is 60 just a number? I mean, I don't think it's just a number. I think it's an attempt to try to prevent overscaling the architecture. I think that's really what it's driving at. So maybe there's another way to do that. Maybe it doesn't have to be 65, but you've got to have some kind of control for
the building to be completed.
So I'll go last. I will say this is the issue that concerns me the most about potential future of this site. I agree. Now, when we revised the code previously, I actually was an advocate for 45 foot wide buildings, and through negotiation, it became 65 feet. So I feel very strongly that, if not the literal width of buildings, the scale and pace and the differentiation of things you move along in the way that everyone is talking about is the most important issue to the success of this as a part of our street, this part of our town. And I agree with that. I'm saying that right now we do have in the code some requirements that attempt to break down the 65 foot facade. If you read the code, it says every 20 feet you have to have this on the roof line, on the facade line, and those are in the code now. It feels to me that, as Adam said, as buildings get bigger, there need to be an additional thought given to how at the next level of scale, like nested above in a way, there's other kinds of things that kind of create variation as you go down the street. So as much as I'd love to see a series of small buildings, I think it's practical to entertain wider buildings, but I think this is where I would feel we'd want to have the most significant project going forward as over its scale. It feels to me like we also more or less have a strong consensus that the 65 foot aspect of the code is a number that might be right, it might be big, it might be too little, but that the real point is to have a way of managing and looking at the architecture and the form so that it creates that sense of activity along the street. And so I think that that is something we can address when we talk about code, the second part. So the third topic then I think is moving down the list, as sort of an extension of the width issue. The code when we wrote it, emphasized the continuity of the buildings along the street. So the issue is this through block passage, which Tim has reminded me. So this is the concept sketch that we were shown last time. And you'll see a new idea that's never really been seen in Narberth, which is this through block passage. Don't read the scale literally, it's a sketch. But the idea is that there would be more than that very narrow passageway that currently leads, I think, between American and Margate. So something where you could actually occupy the space, something that would also provide for the main entry to the apartments above. That's what the orange is, the lobby. This is a new idea, but we don't have a provision in our code for that to occur. The only way it could occur actually is if you subdivide the property, made that a lot, and then didn't put anything on it, and then you still have to work out how the frontage of the next building addresses it. So there would most likely need to be some code revisions to allow for that. So my question really to commissioners is, that idea of that passage, do you think that's a part of the vision that you support or you're concerned about? Who would like to start?
I'll start.
Okay.
Yes. I would very much like to see that. It reminds me, if it's handled properly, it reminds me of little urban situations that exist in European cities everywhere. I'm thinking of Salzburg. I'm thinking of everywhere in Europe, and in some places in the States also. That there are numerous benefits to be had from doing that. I can imagine cafe tables nestled in there, and instead of occupying the streetscape, maybe as an alternative for the ones that occupy the street and parking spaces. What a wonderful place to have a little vest pocket cafe, a couple of tables, and a little quiet perhaps, and some string of twinkle lights overhead. We just love it. It also puts the entrance to the apartments in an advantageous location. I'm sure that's why the design team has advanced this idea. It's off the front where there's valuable retail space, and puts them in the back where there isn't valuable retail space, where there's less valuable retail space. But it's a very logical thing to do, and I'm all for it.
Michael.
Yeah, I mean, I was basically going to say all the same things. You kind of you stole a lot of what I was going to say. The only thing I would add to that is, yeah, I mean, because I work remotely, sometimes I like going and working from coffee shops. I like working from Dead Cafe, but it would be nice to have an outdoor space near there to work during the day and catch people for, an hour and then move on to something else. I mean, I think it creates a nice, amenity, I think, potentially. And I think it would also be, and not that, I mean, obviously, we kind of talked about Town Square Station Circle, which will also provide some great nice space on the other end of it. But I think that there's some interesting opportunity for synergy that you would have spaces on different segments of the block where you can kind of relax, see people, that sort of amenity.
Jen.
I like the idea. I think it potentially has a lot of charm in terms of its, the intimacy of its scale. But, and I hesitate to open up this can of worms, and I think we know what's coming. But I feel like it's a missed opportunity to walk into a sea of metal, a sea of heavy metal, a parking lot. I mean, it just feels so antithetical to the idea of having a promenade type experience where you're faced with just basically a desert of asphalt. And I would also point out again that that parking lot is on the south side, and those cars to generate the heat island effect, which is in direct contrast to the efforts we're making on the green building practices to try to be energy efficient, to try to decarbonize, to try to lower the temperature of surfaces at that location. I think there's just a lot of work to be done there. It needs to be thought about in a sensitive way that's consistent with the thinking at the front. Because looking at it, we may see it as the backside, but again, at the scale of the pedestrian, there really is no front and there really is no back. It's just the experience of the promenade. So let's think about maybe if there's potential in configuring parking that maybe we do carve out some green space. I know you've explored the possibility for putting parking underground. These are all viable explorations, and I would really like to see, what other options you can come up with for that parking lot area.
Just for next.
Yeah, I totally agree. I would like to take it one step further and suggest that, again, the parking lot should be in play. I mean, we're limiting what we build to the footprints of the existing buildings, which seems kind of crazy if the parking lot is there as an option to build on, and that, as Jennifer says, the parking is on the south side of the building, which is always the nicest place to be, and that pocket park is not going to be very welcoming with 3-story buildings on either side and a big entrance lot in the middle of it. If it, in fact, took 2 of the 1-story buildings and made a little bit of larger pocket park, maybe even closer to the alley where the American Family was now. If the American Family building could be retained and could house a market, and then the buildings on the other side of a 2-wide pocket park could be a restaurant that you could flow onto with the seating. I mean, yes, let's get the seating off the street and pull some of the parking area into the whole development scheme. I mean, why couldn't it be a courtyard to buildings all around? I'm feeling this great loss that we're just taking down what's there and replacing it, and we're not looking at the whole site.
So, Rome's not built in a day, although I kind of think we would try to get as much into one generation as we can. Because I think the idea of the Paseo is great. It's on the right track. Even if it doesn't, I think it'll work. And if it doesn't work, it'll sort itself out in the long run, basically. But what it does do is it gives you access to the parking. It gives you a nook that Jim was alluding to. We could potentially use it for cafe space or, all kinds of interesting things you could do in that kind of a nook. I think you could look at building over it too. So it actually is a passage through the building, but you don't have to do that. I tend to agree with Heidi that I think you could build over the parking lot, not just leave it open. There may be some kind of simplicity to the legal arrangement. I know everyone's really concerned about having enough parking, and I think everyone's overthinking that, right? Because if people want to come here, they're going to come here.
Parking's not on the table.
Yeah, well, okay, we're not going to talk about parking at all.
Right, it's not really an issue today.
Well, I'm sorry, but Heidi brought it up and Jen brought it up that it's the southern facade. During COVID, McShay's put out their tent and had the music tent back there. And I think what that speaks to is, was it William White that's like, it's not hard to make a place that attracts people. It's remarkable how often it's not done, right? Like how people work so hard to make places unpleasant. In the long run, that parcel has value. It has economic value far above parking. It can be green space, it can be restaurant seating, it could be development, all of the above. At least a little Paseo is sort of leading in that direction. Maybe someday it goes to some Spanish steps up to the apartment building, right? Because it's a lovely change of levels. Like, you don't get that in Iowa, right? Or in Iowa, Kansas, right? You can play with this, right? So anyway, I think that, if all the zoning is on the table and the demolishing the historic structures on the table, then yeah, go for it. Go for the full package with the pedestrian linkage all the way back. More development back there, more restaurant back there. And then to the point about the market, well, I do actually agree with Heidi that maybe you could save the market building and then put the density further back in the parcel. Like that could work from an arrangement. It wouldn't, I don't think, be impossible to put a market in a new building either if the owner would do that and if there was a business willing to do it. And then the power of the market, again, is to bring people to the site, which will activate all the rest of the program.
So the first is, I think the definition, for the definition of a pocket park is that it's a specific destination point and not a pass through. So in looking at this, while you are providing pedestrian access from one side of the parcel to the other, we really should be looking at it as a moment. The second thing is we're fixating on this particular address, and if the zoning ordinance up for conversation is for all of 5A, how do we define allowing this type of space, this use of space in the rest of 5A? Because while I think in this scheme, it's a very good concept, and I really like pocket parks, and having lived in the city for almost a decade, those moments make a huge difference, even in the middle of skyscrapers. How do we define that in the rest of the 5A area so that you don't have someone who just says, I'm going to demo this building, it's 25 feet wide, and I'm just going to call it a pocket park and not do anything else on this site? So I feel like by definition, it needs to have some verbiage about the activation that it's doing and not just allowing for a vibrancy of the space.
You got?
Yeah.
All right, you can.
This has been an interesting few minutes. I'm fine with the idea of some kind of a plaza back there, but I think as we talked about, I think it really is just the introduction to a much larger and more important discussion about the various uses of the south side of the site and what can be done there besides just the surface parking lot. Up to including decking it over, figuring out a traffic circulation. We haven't talked at all about the town square yet, but a traffic circulation that exits onto Narberth Avenue and doesn't need to go through the town square. Maximizing the southern exposure of these buildings so that they're just not an afterthought. I mean, there's a lot more here than just the plaza. I think the plaza's fine. I think it could probably be developed into a pretty decent exterior urban space. But I think that it needs to be part of a larger conversation about all these issues.
The last, I'm intrigued by this idea. I've lived in cities too. I've lived in Manhattan for 20 years. And I saw a lot of crummy spaces. And I saw, as you were saying, it's easy to get them wrong. So I think I'm open to the idea, but I think it's one that does require a lot of consideration about how it works. I'm really intrigued by my colleagues' comments about how the creation of this space unlocks a lot of bigger thinking about other spaces in this area and relationships between spaces and land uses. And so it feels to me like this, I was not expecting some of these comments, but it feels to me like it is opening up ideas about different kinds of potential for the site, and that at the very least, however it's planned, it should be considered as a potential step to something that grows or evolves into something different or better or connected to something else in the future. That it's not just something that's here and that's that. One thing that occurred to me, I think when you were speaking, Jennifer, that hadn't occurred to me until just now, is that spaces like this in cities generally are highly regulated through easements, through covenants, through rules about public use of public space. And I think that were we to entertain a space like this in Narberth, it really would need to involve a conversation with what the borough's expectation of what the nature of this public space is. Could it be fenced off at any time? Right. Or must it be open at certain times? Conversations with the police about how public safety is considered. I mean, these are realities that places, like New York have been learning since the 60s, since they started coding these spaces in the zoning code. So, I think what I'm sensing from the group is just from a kind of simple proposition. Yes, we'd love to encourage the thinking about this idea, but it opens up a lot of questions about urban space, its use, its management, and how this might actually connect to bigger changes in the future about parking lot or about circulation or whatever. So that's my sense of where we are.
It ain't simple building cities.
It's not simple building public spaces. The last topic is the what's commonly known as the little gym building. As I said before, currently, I believe the code would require commercial on the ground floor. I think historically people have been used to seeing commercial on both floors, or at least some shopping type activity on the ground floor and community type uses like the little gym on upper floor. And the request is to allow for the consideration of this to be used as an apartment building instead. And so I'd like to take everyone's temperature on that. Who would like to chime in?
I'll start again.
Do this first.
I just,
Heidi's fine with it. Okay.
Yeah, I think in real estate terms, it's an outburst. It's gonna be tough to get retail to thrive there. And for that reason, it worked when it was a farmer's market. I think it worked, at least from my standpoint, it did. On the other hand, the farmer's market did ultimately fail for reasons I'm not fully.
Maybe it didn't work so well.
So I guess it didn't work.
It didn't work.
Worked well.
So that brings me back to my first comment, is that it's an out parcel from a retail standpoint. From a residential standpoint, it has distinct advantages that nobody wants to farm. Not that they're funky. So I'm in favor of that being purely residential, not attempting to be something that it is not intrinsically suited for.
I don't like getting it.
This town is like a miracle, although I feel like it's slipping away. Like the fact that there is, and I know the borough doesn't, Lower Marion is the other side of the street that goes over the bridge, which is also bizarre. Right? That's not even in the borough. But you got like the dance, like the ballet studios across the street, which is actually a fairly regionally important studio. And then it used to have, a variety of, originally I forget the story. Anyway, it's on the tip of my tongue, but it had a variety of retail uses. Look, we can survive turning this into apartment buildings, right? It'll be fine as an apartment building. I don't think it's really the highest and best use from a borough perspective, because it is a commercial property. I think it's, back up against the railroad tracks means it's a good place to put something that doesn't mind the noise of the trains, which, I live abutting the train tracks on the south side. I come over this bridge a lot and so on. So I'm very familiar with the trains, but I also think we're rezoning for 3 stories in this discussion. So you could pop the top on this building too, just pointing that out. And it'll fit within the height limit and give you more economic space. So you could also put residential over commercial and get 2 floors residential, 1 floor commercial. Or you could get a microbrewery, you could move the ballet studio in, you could do anything that needs a certain amount of space, a child care center, all kinds of uses that if it's an apartment building, it's just like 8,000 units or 10,000 units. So, which don't get me wrong, we need 10 more housing units, but there's probably other ways we could get them. So if you guys all, if you want to change it, if that's what's going to happen, I think it would be better as a commercial person.
We'd like to go next.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I mean, I remember we had impassioned discussions with the guys about the ground floor of the Elm. And every time I walk up Forest Avenue, I wish that ground floor was commercial. But they swore to God to me that they would never be able to rent it. So we gave on that. I feel kind of similar about this one, but I don't think this is a hill I'm prepared to die on. I'm okay with it being residential. Yeah, maybe that's overstating it a bit. But I'm okay with it being residential. Would I prefer it to be commercial? Probably, but I'm okay with it. It's residential.
Other facts of this side of the table.
Yeah, I'm fine with it being residential. One of the other things that kind of struck me is I think that over time, because we had that presentation about the project and the first filing, I think the number of units in the overall project has dropped over time, which I think is, I'm not happy to see that, because I think that is not to the benefit of the thriving commercial space.
Because they said the park, I think they're just trying to fit the parking.
Right, and so actually,
Parking pulling down the debt.
so to that, and now that we're talking about the backside of the slide, I did actually want to just echo some of the statements about it, you know, about the parking lot configuration not necessarily needing to be exactly the same. Now I understand that there may be forces beyond me that control that. I know that I guess there's an older agreement that provides the borough with kind of veto power over vertical construction over that. I don't know if I'm getting that right or wrong, but it's my understanding. But specifically for the parking lot. But if there were some way to turn that into something other than a space that's dead most hours of the day, right? As most parking lots are, then I would support creative thinking about that backspace. But with that, if to the extent that there's not a broader will to do that, and then I would not like to see the number of residential units in the overall program continue to drop, because I think that is important to continuing to have a thriving downtown district. We talk about the types of uses that we want to see being active uses, and we talk about how we don't have as many active uses as we would like to see. And I think that active uses are directly tied to the ability to have people in them on a recurring basis. And just, I know, in different contexts, so it may not be super relevant, but I know I've worked on projects in different parts of the country where the numbers don't work for someone to put in ground floor commercial space, and it stays empty, or it becomes like a live work unit or whatever it is. And oftentimes in those contexts, it was because they didn't have the people in that vicinity to keep those spaces alive. And so, long way to say, yes, I support residential uses in an apartment building in the village, and creative thinking about the back part of the lot to the extent that there's the will to do that.
I'm okay with seeing it become residential. I think North Carolina is kind of a deactivated commercial zone, so not that there isn't commercial on that road, but it is largely deactivated. And so if anything, the increase in population may just up the traffic running along that corridor, which is outside the road, would just allow for kind of a greater flow throughout that area. No, I'm fine with residential there. But I sometimes enter a little bit of paralysis trying to think of like what Adam was thinking. What would do well there? A microbrewery. Everybody thinks a microbrewery would do well anywhere. Like, nobody's got a problem with that. But so, I mean, I kind of hit a wall, but I'm fine with residential.
Or a microbrewery. Either one.
All else fails, you can always go to microbrewery.
When I'm having a compliment, I come up with the answer I was looking for. I'll write it in.
Or which for the parcel just allow for
It would be.
Yeah.
So if we we follow through the recommendation, change it, either would be possible. We would be.
You can still use it.
The owner to decide how they want to use it. I kind of put in, Adam's camp in the sense that I think residential will be fine there. I do think it's sort of a unique commercial space that we don't have a lot of, and when it's active, like with a little gym, generates oodles of traffic. But sometimes it's only
Can I just
today.
I'm not saying we can regulate businesses in this meeting, but I just want to mention the synergy among businesses. The Little Gym, for example, had Parents Revival Night, right? 20 parents drop off 15 kids or 10 kids, or, right? And then they go to the restaurants and they go to the movie theater and so on. So synergy of commercial uses.
Yeah.
Symbiotic relationship.
In any case, I think in the long run, housing would be fine. I wish there were a commercial answer. So if you don't mind, I'd like to ask Ms. Rubin, what's your assessment of the commercial potential of leasing that space for commercial use?
It's possible, clearly. I would never say that it's not possible. I have ideas on it would be a good fit. It would generate a lot more traffic. One of my ideas, this is just a real life example. I have a fitness club on Haverford Road that happens to be about that size. Pick it up, put it in that building. I've thought about it. Employees alone would need about 15 to 20 parking spaces. And then you have a constant flow. Fortunately, we have a decent membership base post-COVID, and there's a solid flow, and it would soak up, I don't want to exaggerate, but maybe a third of all the parking back there, maybe even half, some at peak. And that worries me because I'm thinking big picture. How does this all work? You know, you can be a victim of your own success. I could put a microbrewery back there that would crush it. And then you would have a line queued up around the block to try and get into these meetings about how, you know, we can't find a place to park. And, you know, I mean, that is I understand the vibe in this meeting, and I will tell you that it's very different than other meetings I've attended where the vibe is maybe more concerned about managing parking. And that's not just from council. That's like a lot of the feedback I get from the community is we kind of like where you're going with this. We sort of like what we see, but what about, you know, that's always the, what about, so
there's never been something in front of the planning commission where that wasn't an element.
So it's something that I grapple with because you certainly can't please everyone. So I'm trying to be realistic. There's so many things I would do if money wasn't an issue. I'll be candid. I mean, I'm being absolutely serious. The floodgates would open, but I do have to manage something that's financeable, partners that are going to invest, feasibility. And I'm not saying that anything gets sacrificed. What I'm trying to tee up is the absolute best thing, knowing that there's a bell curve and that I'm going to try and please the most amount of people. And there's going to be people on either side. Some going to want more density and maybe don't care about parking. And then the other side's going to be very vocal in the opposite direction. Leave it the way it is. And, you know, so could I lease it? Sure.
There's trade-offs.
But I would also just want to revisit, because the devil is in the details. When we talk about the 65 foot, which is another thing that came up, completely sympathetic and agree with the comment that if you cut the ribbon, this thing's done. And the general consensus is this project is monolithic and it doesn't fit into the borough, we failed. It's not the intention. You have to keep in mind that the GET building, when you look at the first plan, and should have never put it up because it's confusing. The GET Cafe, the old firehouse, that stays. The Revival building, that stays. Obviously, we just talked about the Little Gym building, that stays. Right out of the gate, that adds some different heights and some variety, some old, some new. You sacrifice retail. I could happily volunteer to do away with plaza, what I call plaza pocket parking, name it as well, and just monetize it. That's more storefront, it's more rent, and it would work, and people wouldn't know the difference. We thought, you know what? Let's sacrifice a little revenue and create a place, because there was these parking spots that were blocked during COVID. You see what the Greeks did, and you referenced the tent behind McShay's. These cool little areas that seem to work if you create them here. There's definitely on a good weather day, I can see a lot of people would utilize the front portion of that little plaza area, the seating, to either work or socialize or whatever. So I think there's variety. You could say to me, you have to break it up every 65 feet. Sorry. That's the ultimate. And you have to physically create two different buildings. But in the end, it may look the same, because you can solve that problem with material. I mean, you know that better than I do. You're in the planning commission. You can solve and make it look the same. Who knows what's behind the wall, to your point. So I do think that there's every intention to break that up at the commercial grade and sort of recreate. It's not going to be hokey, and we're not going to fake it and make it look like it's colonial Williamsburg. It's gonna be some sort of mixture. You know, people that come here are going to know it's not old, but on the other hand, it should complement. It should be the proper materials. It shouldn't ever look out of place or not worthy. But I do think there's going to be tons of variety along that streetscape. I think that we've got unbiased, amazing architects, creative team that, with or without guidance, we already were designing terraces on the corners, balconies in the middle, all kinds of variety up above. So I'm only saying that because I think a lot of what we're concerned about, we're either going to address or we already have addressed it and you just don't know about it.
I might find out.
Well, I mean, we haven't advanced anything since the March meeting because we weren't sure, you know, we put it out there and we were like, all right, what's the word? Like, we didn't know. And that was always, there was never an expectation that we were going to advance until we sort of, to your point, we got some feedback that says, okay, it's certainly incremental in nature, but all right, you passed first base, now go on and design this thing. And then we jump into the normal process, you know, where you comment on the elevation and the materials and all the things we went through at 203-100.
We are ready for that.
I want to.
If there's a takeaway from this discussion so far, I think it should be that this group is positive and collaborative about your project. So let's get down to the things that are of primary concern to the planning commission and the public also, who are based on the stuff I overhear walking down the street, are concerned about what it's going to look like.
Can I ask
So,
one quick question?
wait.
Just technical
Okay, I want to
question.
turn to public comment so that we can move on to the second part of the meeting. So just please be quick.
For what we're calling 230 Haverford, you said that you were pre-screening residents for single car ownership. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Would that apply also to the
You mean 203? You mean the two that are underway now, or are you talking about this project?
200 block, this one here?
This one?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, the idea would be similar to what we're doing at 203 and 100.
I really want to stay away from parking.
No,
It's not on
but
the table
in that
tonight.
same for Little Gym area?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay.
I also think, while it's interesting to have his comment on that, we do have to see a formal proposal before we really go with that. So I want to be really careful about that. We don't have an application here. We don't have a proposal. So what we want to do is get to that point, like Jim said. So I'd like to move along and ask, is there anyone in the public who'd like to make a comment about any of these issues, the building height, the width, the gym? And I really say 45, we have a lot of work to go through. So please try to be concise and don't, repeat things that have been coming up. So go ahead. Thank you.
I'm Emily Stewart. I just wanted to say two quick things. One is that the spirit of this town is super unique and special, and that has to do with our buildings, but more importantly, it has to do with our people and our history. And I think that we have here a really beautiful opportunity to change, because change is inevitable. But we have a partner here who is interested in changing and preserving the character of our town. So I just wanted to show my support for this plan moving forward. I think what I've heard from Tim and what I've heard from the community, and I spend a lot of time in the community and I've talked to a lot of people, is that people are afraid of things being different because they're afraid of turning out slick and monolithic. We don't want to be suburban square. I think that what we've got here is an opportunity to advance and to clean up and to preserve some of the character, but at the same time, really to improve the quality of buildings. I've spent a lot of time coordinating public art in some of the vacant stores with Tim's permission. I've been inside McShay's, Taco Takeaway, Village Treats, Mapes, and soon Family Market. And the rats are the very, very least of my concerns. There are so many things wrong with these buildings. They are so old and decaying. It is really my hope that we can kind of work together as a community to bring forward this vision, which really continues the character of our community, and lets go of some things that are past their time. I also want to say that there's a lot of talk about the height, the width, and how things will look out of place. We've all had the experience where we get a new couch, it looks ridiculous for about a week until our brains get used to it. And then it looks normal and we don't remember the old couch. And I'm just saying that we do have existing 3-story buildings. We do have things that we're used to seeing, but the human brain does adapt, and we will adapt to whatever happens next, and it won't look weird anymore after a while. So I do think we should preserve our, the gut reaction, which is like, it's going to look weird because no matter what comes new, it will look weird, but we also will get used to it. And I just want to show my support for this project moving forward. I really hope that the Planning Commission will kind of make the approved zoning changes that are required and allow this project and others like it to really improve our town.
Thank you. Any other members of the public?
Really be back. I live on Dudley Avenue and I live in co-ownership. Just appreciating the really thoughtful conversation tonight. And echoing, Emily's comments. I appreciate him really trying to ensure that Narberth continues to thrive. I feel like we're going into a bit of a dip right now. A lot of these family businesses retiring, but Alicia and I feel really optimistic and hopeful for the future. I will say that we interact with so many members of the community on a daily basis that come into the shop. And we're hearing overwhelming support and open-mindedness around change and a project that would ensure that our mom and pop Narberth continues to thrive. So I know there's always concern about change, but what I'm hearing from the community coming in is that they're listening, they're learning, and they're feeling very open-minded about what they've seen so far. So just wanted to make sure I echo that.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Dennis.
Yes, hi. I'm actually speaking as the chair of the Historical Architecture Review Board. And but I wanted to make a few just kind of far-reaching statements. I think that we as a group, there are 4 of us in the room who are members of the heart. We're not opposed to the change. We're embodied really, part of our mission really is to consider the existing streetscapes, existing scale, and to try to advocate for any new development to adhere to that and to sort of be sensitive to that scale. I think it's important to think about how extensive this development really is when you consider how small and rural we are. This is going to affect probably half of what we consider the commercial district. This is the entire south side of Haverford Avenue. We may want to call it 230, but 230 is only American Family Market. Let's be real. This is really a redevelopment of a very large section of our town. It's amazing to me, probably because of ownership in the past, that this has never developed before. That side of the street was pretty much unchanged from the way anybody who was here in 1910 would recognize that stretch of the south side of Haverford Avenue. It was created at a time when Narberth was really initially developed in the 1890s as a strictly residential place. There was no commercial presence. There was no civic presence in Narberth until the early years of the 20th century. We talked about the YMCA building. That was constructed as a civic building that had commercial. All of those storefronts were originally designed in 1908 to be part of that very formal civic YMCA building. So there's been an intent for over 100 years to really create a vibrant commercial space. And I see this as the potential to continue that. And we have a great opportunity. We've heard the word thoughtfulness opportunity mentioned to me, the most interesting part of the conversation that we've all had, that you all had tonight, is the thoughtfulness of the creative solution, of really taking a look at that whole space and say, okay, we've got an opportunity to get this thing right or get this thing wrong. It depends on how we see it and how we work with it. And I think, in that, at this point, we've seen very little other than some plans, some sort of layouts. We've seen nothing that talks about height, it talks about light, it talks about setback. It's all just words and it's numbers. I think that it's time to not only look at something more substantive to be able to continue this conversation, but to really look at that entire space. We talk about the little gem. Our memory of buildings is only what we knew in our lifetime. To us, it's the little gem, or it's the farmer's market. That was an automotive garage when it was first created. That was its original use. American Family Market was an automotive garage. That was the nature of that particular part of our borough. But then it changed and it worked, and it took on new needs as those new needs developed. And I think we've got an opportunity to sort of keep furthering those, but let's be really, really, really smart about it. And to me, that the most exciting part of the conversation, seriously, was the notion of you have to see that space as how are you thinking about that whole space? You can't think about the parking lot as an afterthought. You can't think about Station Circle or the town square as an afterthought. All of that has to be thought of together. Otherwise, you're gonna miss a tremendous opportunity. And I'm
Thank you. Any other public comment? Yes, sir.
Brandon Copeland, also on the board. It occurs to me with your very thoughtful discussion of the height limit as one example where just boiling that down into a yes or no of the height loses the character, the great comments that went into that. There was a lot of discussion around not being monolithic. And I think to just say yes to 3 stories without consideration for all the other things that you just discussed would be selling yourselves short. So how could there be a condition or a caveat to that so that what you get is not monolithic? So by going to allowing 3 stories, you're going to get what you want out of it.
Thank you. That's what we hope to get to next. Any other public comment? Is there any public comment among folks who are watching online? If you'd like to make a comment, there's 2 or 3 folks. I don't see any. So we'll call on public comment at this moment closed. I guess what I'd like to do is sort of try to summarize the sense of the room. Jim, you actually did it for me. Thank you. I think there's a fairly strong support for all 4 of the ideas you've asked us to consider for zoning changes, albeit with, as you were saying, Graham, they're not just crude yes or no questions. There's more details to be worked out. So the building heights, I think there's general support for 3-story buildings, but an interest in seeing how that can be managed in a way so we don't potentially have solid 3-story facades. I think there's an interest in an acceptance that the 65-foot building width is something that we should be flexible on, but with a way of managing the scaling of the building, the way that it's experienced in the street in terms of its detached. I think there's an intrigue with the plaza, but and a sense that the idea of how it works, how it connects, what it leads to now and in the future is worthy of a lot of discussion. And remember, we're not here to discuss a project. We're just here to discuss changes in the code that will allow actually a project to be brought to the table. And I think there's an openness to allowing apartments to be a consideration in that automotive garage building or little gym building. But I hope, and Tim is really intrigued by the kind of 4-dimensional thinking about what businesses go where and parking and the mix. And I hope that while you might have the ability to make that in apartments, that just runs your tool kit and is not a foregone conclusion. I kind of think that's the sense of most of us. And what I'd like to know is if we could sort of make a resolution to that effect so that at least Tim's team knows at this point that they have that level of support for the ideas that they are bringing to us, because I think that's a good basis upon which we can then build the technical changes that we have to go into the code. So I guess I'd like to ask is, does anyone want to move that we or sort of summarize our sense of the room like that? Or do you have other things you'd like to add or concerns? And then we can vote to see who would support that.
You have what you have written down that you just said?
That's here.
Okay, well, I would so move.
Okay, is there a second? Second, Adam. Any discussion about that resolution?
So you're talking about the actual ordinance now?
No, just a sort of sense of how we feel about the four main aspects of the zoning changes that he's asked us about, not the specific ordinance. That I feel like we need to kind of come to agreement that yes, we want to move forward on these changes, and that will empower us then to talk about the code.
Well, I would just like to say, there's nothing inherently wrong with the changes on an individual basis, but that there should be some sub clauses like not 36 feet. Well, first of all, tallest building in Narberth, apparently the cheese shop, 34 feet. So I'm questioning the height. That's one thing. The other is, I don't think it should be across the board 3 stories. I think that would be a mistake. I think there ought to be something in the ordinance that stipulates how much 3-story. In a block or in vicinity or whatever. I think we need to say it can't all be just 3-story, because again, I'm concerned about the historic ordinance.
I'm sorry, we need to be able. You've made the points, and I think the proposition is that we're generally okay with the height, but it somehow needs to be managed in more detail. And we'll have a chance to debate that in actual reality when we talk about the code. Are there any other comments about that resolution? We have first and second, so I will ask that all in favor of conveying that resolution to the team. Any opposed? Okay. So I think the planning commission has determined that there's support for the direction in which you want to go and support for making the zoning changes that you would like to make. We now need to talk about the specifics of this. I would like, it's 9 o'clock. I'd like to break for 5 minutes and then reconvene for a while and see how far we can get with that. What I'd like to point out, the planning commissioners, Michael has prepared a kind of summary of the changes that we've worked on. Which I have a couple copies. Pardon me?
This is part of the 5
minutes. Which you can look at while we have a break. I have a couple copies here. I also have one copy of the draft of the code that some of us have been working on. So let's reconvene at 9:05, 9:06.
No.
And I can talk to you.
Is everyone here? Okay. All right, I'll call the meeting back to order. And what I'd like to do from here, this has been, you mean from here?
Yes.
It's been recorded.
It's paused. You have to hit on.
Oh, my computer says it's recorded. I don't want to make a mistake, but it says it's recorded. Recording. She follows me everywhere.
That means that all my statements about
Okay.
top secret
All of us.
All right. So let's reconvene and talk about start talking about the ordinances that have been proposed. So let me give you a little chronology of this. the solicitor, forwarded us for the first time a week or so ago, 2 weeks ago, the proposed changes that Mr. Rubin and his team wanted us to consider. We tabled them, and last week the solicitor began actually developing proactively, knowing that we would be considering things, a draft of the code. I think the first we saw it was Monday. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we saw it Monday.
It's been a long couple of days.
As the solicitor has been developing code that would implement the changes that have been requested, as well as the green zoning, as well as the changes to 5B, Michael and I have been combing through the solicitor's code too to try to make sure. Our goal is to make sure all the things the Planning Commission has discussed in the past since November are incorporated there. We're not trying to make up new ideas. We're just trying to we're going back to our minutes, our notes, and our resolutions to make sure everything is in there. About green building, 5A, 5B. In addition, we've also reviewed Chloe's records about zoning changes related to the Saldo. Remember, we discussed at length changes that would be needed to be made in zoning codes will be consistent with the Saldo to avoid conflicts between the two codes. And we went through those to try to flag things that would need to be addressed immediately with these other revisions. So really, it was like a clerical task. And we've tried to work with the solicitor in codifying that law. Where we are right now is the solicitor and Michael and I think we have combined all of the Planning Commission's recommendations since November about these matters into this code, except for Chloe's recommendations. We couldn't get to that. So that's sort of stapled on and highlighted. These are things we want to add into this resolution. There's still some corrections. Michael just caught me in the hall and said, I found something. There's a comment in the wrong place.
Comment with big implications.
There's a few things the solicitor still wants to massage. So we've made a lot of progress, but the code that as we have, which we really emailed you at the end of the day. So I know you haven't had a chance to look at it. Still needs that kind of hone, fine tuning and so forth. The applicant just received it today. The applicant for 714 Montgomery just received it today and immediately sent back 2 comments about things they wanted us to look at more closely. So it's all in flux. Our goal, for a variety of reasons, but primarily because we would like to actually see real applications for these projects so we can start talking about all the issues we've been talking about, is to try to move these along as expeditiously as possible. I and Council President Bush have conferred with the team, and they said that in the remaining time we have this evening, they would like very much to see a discussion of the code recommendations we've made regarding building. So in respect to that, and because I think it is also probably the issue that we felt needed to be kind of dug into us, I'd like to start that. What I would like to do is do 2 things. One is figure out how to call up onto my screen that text so we can put it up so everyone can see it. And second, ask Michael, would you, while I'm doing that, would you be able to summarize for everyone what those are? I have your notes printed out.
For which one?
Just the building width issue.
What
your notes?
Yeah, the
I
component
will
that
pull it
I'm
up so everyone can see the drafts that have been emerging, and Michael will summarize it so that you can know what we're talking.
I can also mention briefly the 2 things that are already in the code related to that. That's helpful.
Let Adam.
That would be very helpful.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll start with that. So for mixed use buildings, there are already 2 provisions related to the horizontal massing. So one is that the horizontal mass of any facade shall be interrupted when the distance is more than 20 feet with a projecting or recessed element that adds dimension to the otherwise flat pattern of the front facade, such as, but not limited to, a courtyard frontage, building entrance, pilaster, brickwork, or cast stone. And then the other provision is that the horizontal line of the roof eave at any facade shall be interrupted when the distance is more than 20 feet with a vertically projecting or recessed element that adds dimension to the otherwise straight line.
And in terms of the,
You're gonna talk about the changes?
yeah,
Okay, so first, everyone understands those provisions that Chloe just read are in the code now. They are accompanied by the 65-foot width. So they were envisioned as a way of managing the 65-foot width. And in the drafts that are circulated, there's no discussion of changing those. So those would be a baseline to begin with. And what we're talking about now is whether there should be additional requirements related to the scaling and architectural design that would help us achieve what we're all talking about. Okay, sorry, Michael, go ahead.
yes, so there were two sections of the ordinance that dealt specifically with allowing changes to the 65-foot facade width requirements. Just for reference, those are what is in the current ordinance in section D and section N-3. Effectively, what that would do in layman's terms is establish a conditional use process by which the 65-foot limit could be exceeded through a review process of the types of things that were being discussed earlier. I will say that this specific thing is not my complete bailiwick. So smarter minds than I have produced kind of the baseline proposal for what some of those conditions might be. And they're here on the screen in front of you, but the concept being that I think that a lot of the values that were discussed earlier in terms of being open to providing flexibility on that specific 65-foot number, but ensuring that we have a pedestrian environment that meets all of the things that we've all said we want to see. I believe that was these were calibrated with the idea of effectuating that. I think that's my understanding. I think is that your understanding as well?
Vocabulary of the day. So what you see on the screen here is right. Actually, Adam and Jim and I conferred on these yesterday. I'm wondering if would you like to speak to these? What's in here? Or,
I think we already covered it.
Okay, well, one of the things I'd like to say for the audience and for everyone here at the Planning Commission, currently these requirements are proposed to be reviewed through a conditional use process. And one of the tricky things about a conditional use process is that you may in your code establish conditions, but they need to be as objective as possible. It can't be a condition that, well, you will get your approval if Jim likes it.
That's funky, you get to.
You can't say the condition is it needs to be funky because that's not objective. The condition could be it has to have golden slippers. It has to have a whatever, but it can't be that it can be funky. So the trick in doing this is to give as much concrete specific direction without actually designing a building, because we also don't design buildings. So if you don't, I'm happy to kind of summarize. And do you want to speak to these, or would you like me to speak to
if necessary?
Okay, well, I'm going to explain to our colleagues what's in here and also to the public. The first line here, A, is sort of the statement of what we actually all said for 45 minutes, that, we want to see variety. The second statement, B, introduces the idea you were getting at, that there needs to be another scaling device that is greater than 20 feet. Some next level of scaling. So we use the word section. Believe it or not, we debated that word for a while ago. SARS is out, but it's a section. And the basic idea here is that the building should be differentiated. If it's more than 65 feet, it should be differentiated as having different sections. The maximum width of a section should be a third of the width of the building, or 45 feet, whichever is less. So you're always going to have a 45-foot section. And we thought of that, but frankly, divides 135 feet into three. So pretty much that would mean a building on Haverford Avenue would have three sections. So I think that's a pretty objective standard. Is there a section that's that's differentiated? Then the provisions go on to explain how these sections could be differentiated. And here's where you may get a little less concrete. But the section should be differentiated by vertical elements. I think, it doesn't say what, it suggests architectural ornamentation. The other part of the code actually has a similar provision that there should be vertical differentiation. And so that's language we can build on. So it means if you have three sections, each section has to be differentiated from the other. It can't be a flat. The second is that within each section, the pattern of windows should be different. So it appears like there's actually three different compositions of the windows. I think you could say that's objective in the sense they're not the same. They're the same, they're not different. Doesn't say how different they need to be, but it suggests that if you look at how the pattern of windows, the locations, dimensions, the types, where they are located according to the ground plane, is something that ought to vary from section to section. Third thing it says is that there should be variation from section to section in the signs. You just can't have one band of signs that's consistent the whole way along the block. That in each section, signs should be different types, different dimensions, different, again, elevations from the ground. The sign may be 12 feet, one side might be 14 feet or something like that. A variation in materials, textures, and colors among the sections. So they should use different materials, colors, and textures. And then a variation of masonry feature treatments. So those are the ways. In our quick work last night, we tried to explain how you can make a differentiation between sections of the buildings without really prescribing a design. These things just should be different among the sections. We also have a provision that each section shall have at least one door. I mean, I'd love to see three of these, but we debated that and thought that at least each of those major sections should have a door. Whether the door is an emergency door, a front door, a door, what kind of door we don't know, we should have a door. And that kind of gets to Adam's comment. There are actually 13 doors in that one. There's a prescription that any surface visible from the street should not have aluminum or vinyl siding. And that any facade visible from the street should be shown to the planning commission. The elevation should be shown to the planning commission for its recommendation, and the approval of those facades should be part of the conditional use of the building. So those are our efforts to try to articulate the kinds of things that should vary from section to section of the building without getting too detailed about specific dimensions or patterns or arrangements. So first I'd like to hear from the planning commission about that. If you feel like that is what you were thinking about when you were thinking about suggesting we have, rules or a way of assuring kind of variety along the street. I don't know, Jim or Adam, do you want to say anything?
Well, I see two hands just went up over there. They should.
Jim, please.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Jen.
Please.
All right, and what was going through my mind yesterday as we concocted this admittedly simple-minded recipe was that it is knowing that it's simple-minded, it's impossible to write a handbook for the design of a streetscape. It's impossible. That's what the architect is paid to do. But the thing that I was thinking as we talked about it is that its primary function is to encourage a collaborative relationship between the designers and the reviewers. Collaboration is the key to success here, as it has been for every major project that we have undertaken in Narberth in the last 10 years between developers and reviewers. Every time there's been good collaboration, there's been a great result every single time. So we are hoping for that. And that will lead better than any simple how to bake a down center cookbook recipe. That will lead to a good result.
AJ?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this requirement for so much variation across these relatively small sections, vertical sections of building is overbearing. I think it's trying to reinvent the wheel 1,000 times is not necessarily going to yield the best result. And in my mind, I'm thinking of like, look at brownstones. They're pretty much all the same, but they have beautiful texture and variation, and they're recessed, and they have shade and shadow, and those are the things that make them beautiful because they have proportions, like classical proportions and geometries that you want to see them repeat. And San Francisco, Victorian buildings in San Francisco, same. They repeat and they're beautiful in the repetition. I think this requirement for changing it up all the time is a little unsettling. There is something to be said for getting it right. And that's one side of what I'm thinking. And correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but the other side of it is, let's think about variations in materials. If you're using glass, like beautiful thermally insulated glass, modern enclosure, who knows, maybe that will happen down the line. Or like I said before, if you're using mass timber and you have a different thickness of interstitial spaces between windows, and different allowances architecturally in terms of constructability of a window. Let's not be so demanding. And I agree. I think a collaborative process is the best approach.
Remember that what you're doing here is you're writing a rule book in a code. Any one of us designers would, none of us designers would employ every one of those tricks in any given design problem. They are illustrative of the tricks that can be employed to achieve the desired result. So when you write a code to describe the design process, I mean, you're welcome to try. We gave it a try, and this is where we've got to. But I would submit that it is impossible for mere mortals to describe orders the design choices that one makes when one is sitting there drawing the facade. Can't be done. So we're trying to encourage a thought process on the part of the person that actually sits to draw that elevation, to employ one or more of those kinds of devices to achieve the desired result. Not all of them.
I'm not totally on board with that, but I see your, the objective in regulating. I get it. I just not.
Okay, let's hear from others.
My observation about this is, with a good designer, you don't need to do this. With a bad designer, you could write a whole encyclopedia,
right,
and it won't matter.
That's right. Yeah. You have to presume that there's a bad designer involved.
Well, and that's why you could write volumes, and it ain't going to make them a good designer. my humble opinion. So
Look,
I'm not sure
I
what
don't
I
want to say, what I'm trying to do is respond here to what we discussed earlier, that if we are to entertain buildings that are larger than 65 feet, there needs to be certain outcomes that we want. And so I guess the real question is if you feel that we should try to manage those outcomes through a processes in the code or not. And if let's want to make sure, I mean, is that something that you feel is worth our doing? Like you're saying good designers will do it, bad designers never will, no matter what. So it sounds like don't bother. Or should we bother?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I certainly haven't gotten into this in depth that some of you guys have gotten me lately. You know, we got into it to a certain degree with the form-based code, and that degree is enshrined in there already. I don't know if this additional level will yield to a better result. I don't know. I guess I said I'm a little skeptical that it will. I mean, yeah, I think there might be some landmines in here, like you talk about the number of doors, and then you say, yeah, but it could be an exit door, and I'm thinking, yeah, a flat metal exit door with no hardware on the public side is pretty deadly. So what does it mean when we're saying one door per X number of feet? That could lead to a pretty bad outcome. So I don't know.
No doors would lead to that outcome. So how would you manage that?
Well, I don't know. That's the problem. Like usually it's very hard to design, to write a design manual when we said from the very beginning of the formulation of the form-based code that it was not underlined a design manual. So I just scratched my head here.
If you don't mind, Mr. Careless wanted to make a comment.
I'm offering this just for the benefit of the commission, just from a legal perspective. Typically, I'm not complaining about the conditional use because we have to go for conditional use anyway. Still misunderstand my motives here. But usually a conditional use is actually tied to an actual use. The classic example is you allow a stadium by conditional use so that you can actually tie reasonable conditions to the actual use. You have to have the lights off, manage parking. So it's an actual use that you can manage through the conditional use process. And here, we're not actually managing a use, we're managing design elements. And the problem that I see from a legal perspective, I'm not trying to be Mr. Walker here, you can talk to him about this, is if we go in, and you're right that if we go in and we could argue all day about subjective guidelines, but I'm taking it one step further. And if we actually design something that complies with all of this and you say, wow, that looks awful. Well, I don't have a choice. I have to comply with it because I want to get my use. And if I don't comply with it, I have to go get a variance. So at a minimum, I agree. I understand why the commission wants to have this in place because you want to have some regulation over how a building such as ours would be designed. Even if you trust the design team, you want to have something in place because it's out for everyone. Everyone. I mean, at a minimum, I would think maybe this would be better served, these guidelines would be better served in something like Saldo, that if we came to you and said, okay, we comply with everything that's in your Saldo, and you say, you know what, but number 3, as applied to this particular project, once we actually put pen to paper, doesn't work, well, then we could get a waiver for that. The commission would support a waiver saying, I actually don't want you to do this, design it, switch it. The conditional use process really isn't, and I agree with you wholeheartedly, this is totally collaboration. And the conditional use process really isn't, it's a hearing. It's where you have to say, yes, I need this, no, I don't need this. If you don't need it, don't get your conditional use. So it's really supposed to be boxes you check. And then now, if you have something that says you have to have minerals every so often, that's a measurable standard, no argument permitted. But these sort of subjective, arguably subjective guidelines, I think they're well aimed. It's just maybe in the wrong place in the zoning ordinance. So that's just some perspective for you to consider as your.
Well, I think it's an interesting idea. I'd like to ask Chloe from your point of view.
I actually really like design requirements in Saldo, and I've encouraged them in other communities that don't have anything form-based in their code to put them in Saldo because it offers that kind of flexibility. You can fill out kinds of. I think that generally speaking, design requirements are fine in the zoning or the Saldo, like from a legal perspective. I'm not sure about I don't think there's a problem putting them under conditional use, but it does, there isn't any flexibility there. If you're like, well, like if you say your windows are different and then in council, they have to just say, okay, yes, you did that. Right, but yes, you can put them in the Saldo, put design requirements in the Saldo, and that might even encourage the planning commission to want to put more in, because there is the possibility of that they're like, well, we put in, these 10 things you wanted, but this doesn't work. You could waive that, and it could work in the Saldo or the zoning.
The first thing you said is you thought maybe there's advantages for using the Saldo.
I do, because I think that you want that flexibility, and that you generally,
Just to be clear, are you saying in the Saldo instead of the zoning ordinance?
Correct.
For the reasons that were given a minute ago, that you can, the waiver and you can work around it with waivers instead of a variance.
Yeah, so you might say as applied, this particular standard, we actually don't want to see on this because of X, Y, and Z reason, or you want to see a change. And if it's a conditional use, I would say to you, I'm not changing because then I'd have to go for a variance, and we're not doing that. Even if you supported it, I would say, but if it's in the Saldo, you say, you know what, as we're trading the drawings, which we're going to do for quite a long time on this project, you're going to say, actually change this, change that, and say, okay, and if that results in having to get a waiver, that is a little bit more of an easier path forward in the approval process way for us to say, we apply that waiver, and assuming you stand the reason recommends it, you recommend as council grant, because that's a better logic.
That makes sense.
So you're thinking, Bob, also that, I think, were you suggesting also that changes the tenor of the conversation to be more collaborative and less adversarial?
I think that, well, I think it adds to Chloe's point more flexibility in the conversation, because if this was adopted and this was a conditional use, and we had to comply with this, we had a hearing, I would put Mr. Layton on, and I would do the design, and I would say, you check this box, check this box, check this box. And you guys might say, wow, this ornamentation, I don't know what that means, but this ornamentation looks terrible. We would actually want to do away with that. We want to move it around and push and pull it. And I think something where you're talking about design standards, they're meant, again, Mr. Cuomo's point, they're meant to be pushed and pulled throughout the entire process. Because we're going to have a preliminary process, we're actually going to have conditional use with the height, you're going to see it, preliminary and then final. So there's going to be constant pushing and pulling. And if we go for conditional use first, we get it, I don't know, then that locks us into this design as we come back to the preliminary and final. Because we're not changing it, because we have to change it to go for variance or conditional use, and I don't think we would do that.
So again, suppose we propose this as a Saldo amendment.
Correct.
Is there anything concerning to you if it were in the context of the Saldo amendment?
I think, I know you guys, by the way, I think that as a Saldo, I think we have a little bit, I think we were better, this feels better to us as a Saldo requirement, because we could say, okay, we're going to design this as you want here. But we might come into that first meeting, the planning, and say, no, we designed this way. Cecil actually has a suggestion for a better, and you might agree with that. And then we say, okay, well, maybe that's a waiver. I'm trying to think of a middle ground between not making it a guideline.
What I'm saying is, like, I think you present a good case for that.
Yeah.
So what I'm wondering is, if we were to say, yeah, we'll just say we'll recommend this as a Saldo, and supposing Mr. Waldo agrees, is there anything in here you're uncomfortable with?
No, I don't think so, because there could be a dialogue about it down the road. Right. I mean, if I can make an example, take the windows being various sill heights, and that could, and somebody I think already mentioned this, it could lead to very undesirable results. Whereby if we were sensitive from the outset to what we were trying to achieve as far as something that fit in, that everybody would be very comfortable with day one. They all might have the same sill height. They may all be the same proportions. It may just be the pattern. As an example.
That's a good example.
I'd like to also flag for everyone else here something Mr. Careless said is if the conditional use hearing occurs early in the process and there's a design, then they're locked into that, and then like further down the way, it's harder for them to change. This is, I believe, another advantage of what you're suggesting. I made a turn for you.
Yeah, I'd like to make a comment. Are there regulations about stores, the width of a particular retail establishment in our codes? I mean, in other words, I don't care if the storefronts are all the same. It's the businesses inside that add the color and the interest and the signage and variation that I think we're looking for. If we limit the storefront size and we say that businesses can only be so wide, or that there's one 65-foot wide business or one 45-foot wide business, and then next door there's a 25-foot wide business, very similar to what we have now, I think we're going to get that variety that we're all asking for. And that it's not the storefront itself that has to be designed to have these variations. It's what you see when you walk past each business.
Well, I mean,
and that can be regulated. So.
I'm assuming it can, I don't know, but I don't believe we have any storefront width requirements.
We used to.
Well, we have like requirements, like maximum width for commercial buildings.
For what used to be actual retail.
Kevin will probably be. Maybe, turn the camera on, I don't know if you want to.
Did you turn your camera on because you want to make a comment, Kevin?
Yeah, I was just kind of adding to what Mr. Careless just said, and I think it's hard for me to review anything for conditional use and not give a rejection letter or force them to go to the zoning hearing board with kind of these, you know, they're more, I guess, emotional decisions that you're making in subsection C that I can see on my screen. And I think a conditional use has to be by right. And what Bob, I think, is saying is if you disagree with them, I don't think that I can say it's by right. And therefore that conditional use is almost not valid anymore. So I agree that this is better served in the Saldo.
Kevin, do you know now or in the past if we ever had any in Narberth any requirements about the maximum width of storefronts or actual stores?
Sorry, Todd, I didn't pick that up at all. I apologize.
I need to not look at you while I speak, Kevin. Do you know, past, has Narberth ever had any maximum store widths? None of us can think of it, but we wonder.
Not old enough. You'd have to have been here 100 years ago.
No,
I think there were before in the old.
Does that ring a bell, Kevin?
Yeah, no, I mean, not in terms of like an actual store width. I mean, there's design lists for like commercial buildings and mixed use buildings in terms of like architectural features, but not in terms of an actual store width, you know, in an individual tenant space, there's not, no. I mean, I think that the grocer is the largest width, you know. I think that 65, I'm kind of curious where that 65-foot width came from. I don't know any other stores that are wider than that.
That was what Rickland's was.
Okay.
All right. So thank you, Kevin. We can entertain a conversation about store widths, but I kind of want to consolidate ground on the issues that we have now. So let me ask the commission if, first of all, hopefully we've made the distinction between the Saldo and the zoning code clear. Has anyone objected if it were workable for these to be part of the Saldo rather than the zoning code? It sounds like there are benefits from our zoning officer, from everyone involved. Okay. Secondly, is there any, I know Heidi, you've asked consideration of another topic, which we can do, but as to what we've already put on the table, are there any concerns about that?
I just have a question. Does it make sense for A and B to be in the zoning code and then for all of C and lower to be in the Saldo so that you're defining that there is this need for facade treatments and is specified with like a maximum variation and then the rest of it is confined in the Saldo?
Same issue.
I think what they're arguing is that the real problem is that it's a conditional use.
Yeah.
But that's an interesting point. There might be some things that.
Yeah.
I know, Tim, you'd like to speak, and I'll call on you in a second. I just want to make sure there's any other comments in the planning commission about what's here. Okay.
We just wanted to address the store fronts.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
I mean, that's what I've done for 30 plus years. What you want and what you described is going to happen organically.
Right.
But if you legislate it, you could end up with vacancies because it's hard to dictate things. But I can tell you from the nature of Narberth, it's not in any jeopardy of like big boxes or whatever. It's going to be some mixed bag of things.
Exactly.
And it's going to happen organically. If you said nothing and did nothing, it would just.
That's what I think.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you. Well,
But it won't happen if you allow 65-foot store.
Oh, but my only point is there could be an exception that you would regret. Like maybe it's some amazing prepared good grocery store, you know, a Malvern buttery thing that needs. And if you can't give them what they want, they're gone. So you may regret it.
That's true.
So
That's true.
so how are you giving? Like Tim just said, would you like to pursue the conversation about?
Well, I don't know. I don't know. That's a zoning issue, another topic. I mean, I appreciate that. I mean, I think maybe there ought to just be something in there that says you can't have 2 65-foot stores next to each other. To me, that is limiting the opportunities for the smaller stores to be there.
It's a 65-foot building.
If putting.
I know, we're talking about
breaking it up. This seems like a technical question. But if this in the saldo gives more flexibility to waive requirements that aren't workable for a particular project, and if this project's already going to have to go through the same process from the saldo, if it accomplishes all the right goals, then that seems like a solution to me at least. And then
what sounds like a solution?
The idea that you can get at this issue of not putting a big box in or whatever, you know, that not having a monolithic project because there is no precedent for a monolithic project on this street or in this.
Well, all I'm saying is that I think that it's right. I don't think it should be in our zoning code, these conditions, because what you're asking for, which everybody is suggesting, is a stage set or a Disneyland type of approach.
I don't want to interrupt, but I do want to respond to that.
Okay.
No, are you finished?
I'm finished.
Well, I just, okay, you know, so we have our little aerials up here on the side, but the movie theater was originally 1 screen, now 2 screens, but it's a large black box, but it doesn't come to the street because when movie theaters were built at the turn of the century, everything could be rented, right? You wouldn't want to waste a retail street with blank walls when you could rent that space, right? And also maybe architects, maybe they were better, maybe there was zoning to help with this too. And there were a lot more theaters 100 years ago than there are now because there was no cable TV, right? People went out. So what they did is they put the box behind a 20-foot deep or 25-foot deep liner, which is now where the Chinese restaurant is and that kind of stuff, right? And then above, since we have a 2-story liner, is the yoga studio. And then the rest of the box is actually blank. That's exactly like Disneyland, to be honest. There's a lot of blank boxes behind the facade. But what it does is it creates a zone of commerce organized around the pedestrian. It's pleasing to the eye, attracts people, it functionally works, and it is 100% capitalist oriented, but it's also good urban design. So I don't think you can legislate good design. We're just trying to prevent the worst
thing that could happen. I really think that's all we're really discussing tonight, which, the best could happen without any code at all. It's just totally up to chance at that point, right? So all we're trying to do is protect the value for the larger.
Everyone runs out of gas at 10, so I will focus. I think there's a general consensus here that something like what we've got here, Section 8, is better in the South. It provides a better, more flexibility in the implementation and a better place or a way to have a conversation. So I think that is something we can take back and ask Mr. Walker about. Really, last thing we're talking about is, since Heidi put it on the table, is should we include anything about the Brian Sturwitz or maximum Sturwitz? I want to make sure that gets aired out, so we decide it and we don't have to talk about it again.
I think if we put it in there as this, like whatever width it is, 45, 65, whatever you want to say, like no more than one storefront in a block that's 60, whatever, and then you can waive it if it's not workable.
Okay, let's be specific. We're talking about a tenancy. We're not talking about a storefront.
Right.
Let's just be clear on that.
Yes.
Right. Is it a portion of the facade that's for one business? Is that what you mean?
Yes.
I think we're limiting ourselves if we start putting specific dimensions on it, because we're locking in the flexibility of the space. So if you build a building, let's say you do 65 feet or less, you don't get a conditional use. At the time of the construction, you have one tenant. In 20 years, that tenant moves out, your vacancy is too large, you can't fill it. Now you want to subdivide it.
Well, you can subdivide it.
Right, but you're just breaking up the tenant. So if you start making, but in reverse too, let's say you have one building, you build it 65 feet, you put 5 tenants in that strip of space. And then over time, people move out and you start consolidating them. If you start dictating what that dimension is, aren't you prohibiting the flexibility of those new tenants?
Would you be able to come in afterwards and pull building permits to remove, I guess?
They've done that in Harvard.
Pretend you were in a mall and you had a leased space, you had Kohl's or something in the mall, they went out of business, and there's a vast amount of space. You could easily subdivide the space made vacant with a bunch of, smaller dimensional businesses.
That makes sense to me. I guess my
question is in reverse, which is, what if you have Kohl's already, and then TJ Maxx or BJ's or someone were to come in to do another? Would you allow that? Okay.
Well, how would you get the space?
Well, I think my question is more so like, let's imagine, and this is a highly specific scenario, but just so that I can get my arms around this. Let's say you had, a cafe, coffee shop, and the thing next to it was vacant. But we had some sort of rule that said that the storefront can only be taxed. Would that prevent the coffee shop tenant from taking down the wall and expanding into the vacant space if it would bust whatever standard is in place in terms of width of tenancy?
But not if it's a generous enough standard. The issue is that CVS is like 12,000 to 14,000 square feet. This isn't the market for big box, agreed, right? We're not on a commercial arterial, but legally, if CVS wanted to lease the entire block and put a Rite Aid there, I mean, it would be one door, no storefronts, Rite Aid.
So what is that? What do you?
At least,
okay, so that,
if you say that a commercial, one business width is, I don't like this either. It doesn't feel right, but I mean, it's like, say it's 45 feet, then, you have to break the block into multiple units so that it remains what it has been since the town was founded, which is individual businesses, not one business.
Feels big restrictive.
It does. And I think as long as we insist upon a treatment of the facades down the street, you could have a CVS, Parish Park, behind a variegated facade, and it would be okay from an architectural standpoint.
I personally don't agree with that.
No, I don't agree.
I don't agree with that. Sorry. You guys post your job.
I mean, I don't know what the market will bear. I mean, Tim can certainly speak to this better than I can, or most of it probably. I don't know what you're gonna rent. I don't know what is out there to be rented. I don't know what your vision is for this block. Could you clue us in a little bit? Like, do you need a 65-foot storefront?
I just like to have flexibility because you just don't know. My prediction is, as I said earlier, that, you know, knowing the types of prospects that I've seen for 203 and 100, knowing the lack of vehicular and just the nature of Narberth, I don't think it really is conducive, and parking, quite frankly, it's just not going to attract huge users. But I would just be scared to overthink this, because one of the holes we have is clearly a market. There are a few other holes that I don't know exactly how much frontage they have. I mean, I can guess, but I could be wrong. That's
Is on the other properties, are you expecting like one tenant in each of them?
In Rickland, so far, it's split. Every prospect, we haven't had a single prospect that wanted the whole Ricklands.
Okay.
So.
Okay, so it's naturally going to be.
It's about 4, and we're going to split it. There's a column line right down the middle, and we're going to put a pharmacy on one side, hopefully. We're at lease with them, and then someone saved the outboard for funny you mention it, because our top of the first thing we saw was like a pub or a brew pub or whatever with like a little bit of an elevated menu, and just haven't landed one. But
how many square feet?
It's about 4, so it's like 2 and 2, 2,000 feet.
2,000 each.
What concerns me about this whole discussion is, we've all known this, the nature of retail has changed so dramatically in the last 20 years that, to constrict it too much is to put constraints on something that is going somewhere that nobody can predict.
But maybe there could be, it's one of these review processes. I mean, I just think that if somebody wants to come in and rent 65 square feet of frontage, could there be a review before that?
What do you want to review?
I don't know what the business is. If it's a market, if it's a food market, yes. If it's
I don't think we can go that far.
I'm asking the question. I mean,
councils are not on the.
I think we need to be a little more.
Flexibility and all that. But Narberth and retail. And if you're watching the market, you'll see that there is an influx of affluence by virtue of market prices. And I do think that is going to feed a desire for like upscale, higher end, maybe a mom's market we were talking about in Harb, or those kinds of organic products, things that are a little bit more what people are looking for, people with young children, even older people. I think, this is something that it's a health conscious decision. And having trained here at the center, Narberth is one of the very few towns on the main line that has that capacity to bring people in and move people out on public transit. And that is just a comment that I would want to make regarding, the future of retail here.
We're 10 o'clock. The topic of the table is not future of retail. I want to be respectful, but it's not. It's whether or not there should be a rule about the width of buildings. Okay, so let's.
But just to clarify, I was making the case for, of course, for market.
But we're not here to pick businesses. Okay, that's not our job. And we have no expertise in that. The only question on the table is, should there be, in addition to all these other things, some sort of rule about the mix of building or store widths or the maximum store. I know we'd all love to have one kind of business or another, but it's really not productive to talk about that. What did you want to say?
Yeah, I was just to that point. I mean, I think the point that resonated with me the most was the point about needing flexibility for these types of processes and then going forward. So to that end, I mean, I would just, whether we institute something along those lines or not, I would want it to be something that is flexible. I know because I've seen projects at work that it may, like, we're in a very difficult economic period right now in terms of financing projects. And I've seen projects that I've worked on that aren't necessarily moving forward, but looking at those sites, I know that something's going to happen in those things within the next 5-10 years. And that flexibility is a key way to ensure that you're providing an ability to adapt in a tough economic environment.
So what I'm hearing is, it seems like flexibility is important. There's a fear of too many large stores and not enough fine stores, but I don't hear real idea jumping on how to do that. So I think we kind of need to table it. It's like every.
I can just put everyone's mind at ease. Again, I'm just injecting reality because sometimes you get lost in the sauce. If you look at the chunk before you hit that plaza, which you can't jump the plaza because at that point there's a hard break. There's only 4, 5, 6, 7. There's like 12,000 feet. If we did one bigger store, a market or whatever it may be, you're only going to have 4,000 feet after that. And it's going to be relatively get shallower as you move away from the deep spot. You're only going to be able to do a bigger store in deeper space. So I think the concern, it's a good conversation, but I just don't think the space physically can even accommodate. It's not even a realistic possibility. That's what I'm saying. If you did the one big store, you wouldn't have enough space to do another big store physically. So I just wanted to point that out.
And also, there's literally no other site in the borough that we're going to have the same conversation with. Am I right about that? I can't think of any.
You knock things down.
So far.
Well, but not only knock things down, there have to be a consolidation of property owners.
I think that we've exhausted this topic. So I don't feel there's a kind of idea emerging that we should have something in place about it. If one emerges, perhaps we'd entertain it. Because it's late, I think we've arrived at a very interesting idea about how to manage this proposal. I do sense the consensus that having it in the Saldo is more productive all around. So thank you for that suggestion. It gets us close to where we're going to be, both outcome-wise and process-wise. So that's just one we'll have to discuss that. It's listed there. What I would encourage everyone to do is take Michael's notes and take the draft of the code and read it, because there's a very good chance that we might need to wrap this up at our next meeting. We'll have to confirm with the Borough Council about how they'd like to proceed. I don't know how they want to proceed, but it's quite possible we'll have to finish up next time. So I'm sorry if I've been short with anyone here. It's just that we have a lot to get through, not a lot of time. It's really important to stay focused. And I know we all have numbers, we don't have this and that, but we sort of have to really go down this as well as we can. So thank you all for your patience with me. Tim, thanks for being here. I think it's going to be really helpful to be able to just have a conversation with you here. As you can see, good ideas emerge when we have these meetings, and we're open to them. So we appreciate that very much. So I'll ask for a motion to adjourn. Thank you, Mr. Adjourn. Aye. Any opposed? Thank you, everyone.